Do you believe in God? Regardless of the answer to that question, you very likely didn't think I was talking about believing in Quetzalcoatl or Zeus or any of the tens of thousands of gods that have existed in human history. You probably assumed I was referring to whether or not you believed in a specific God, the Abrahamic God of the Christian Bible and the Torah. But how did a mere storm god become the all-powerful deity of half of the world? And how come we don't know his name? Here, we are not going to look at what the Bible says about God, but rather what history says about the Bible, where the idea of this God came from, and how he took over the modern world. YHWH, Yahweh or Yahweh as more scholars call him, or Jehovah if you prefer to use a name invented in the 16th century, is the Abrahamic God and the God of the nation of Israel. And believe it or not, we don't know for certain where this God originated from beyond the fact that he comes from the Levant region. Most scholars believe that he was initially some kind of deity related to war. Although his origins have been lost to time, the earliest we can trace his existence is to the end of the Bronze Age, with the oldest possible appearance being an inscription from the time of Amenhotep III about the Yazoo, or JHWA, with the Yazoo being nomadic Arabs. But at that time, Yahweh wasn't the almighty, all-knowing God who created everything and knows it all. He was just one divinity within a larger pantheon, similar to how Ares is the god of war in the Greek pantheon, but is neither the most powerful nor the most important god. He was such an unimportant god that there are no records of his origins because he was a secondary god. Of course, everyone knows about Zeus and Poseidon, but very few know about Eris, the goddess of descents and insults. And Yahweh was even less important than Eris because we know more about her than we know about Yahweh. It wasn't until the early Iron Age that Yahweh began to gain importance and started appearing in history. At that time, a group of Canaanites were becoming independent, forming their own culture, and well on the way to becoming the Israelites, so they needed a new god. Okay, thank you, silence, please. We're checking to see if we have everything we need to be our own civilization. Let's see if we have everything on the list. Agriculture? That's Bob's responsibility. It seems to be going well. Economy? Well, we decided that any people we defeat will be our slaves forever and ever, so that's all good. The modem is getting installed on Tuesday, and I think that would be... Oh, no, wait! Who's going to be your main god? Mary Jane. Bob, we're going to change your job. That's not a real god, and we can't just take the same gods we used to have as Canaanites. We broke away from them because we wanted to be different. How about Zeus? The new god of the Greeks? That one wouldn't make it 100 years. Yahweh. What? Yahweh. Wait, isn't that the storm god? Not just any kind of storms. It's not the kind of storms you want to come to renew the land. It's the kind of storms you fear. The ones that destroy houses, crops, and civilizations. That's the God we need, not a creation God. A God of destruction to instill fear in our enemies and our future slaves. Are you sure we should enslave people? Why not start a society based on mutual support and common good so we can progress as humanity? Okay, then Yahweh is our God. Once the Israelites adopted Yahweh as their God from the Canaanite pantheon, this storm and war god of the Israelites became their main, most important god. That is exactly why he is described as the god of the armies and as a divine warrior in multiple instances, not only in archaeological evidence, but also in the Bible. As a god of storms and destruction, he was associated with lightning storms and floods, and although I couldn't find a historian's opinion on the matter, it seems very logical to me that this is why he was associated right from the beginning with the flood myth, when the Israelites adopted that myth, which, remember, ends with a promise not to destroy humans again, with the flood. It makes more sense if you think of Yahweh as an angry storm god who kept flooding more and more people every time he was enraged, culminating in the Great Flood, when he destroyed so much that he decided never to do it again. By this point, Yahweh had gone from being a secondary storm god to the main god of an entire nation. Not bad for a god so unimportant that no one cared to preserve his origins. And this god was gradually becoming an exceptional god. The oldest known temple dedicated to Yahweh is an open-air altar dated to the 12th century BC in the hills of Samaria with a bronze bowl. Why a bull? Well, because in the beginning, bulls were associated with Yahweh and with other similar Canaanite gods. Remember, at that time, it was common to use idols as representations of the god you worship. So that altar is quite similar to other religious altars of that era. But something very odd began to happen. Over time, bulls almost completely disappeared from the cult of Yahweh and were not replaced by anything else. Instead, Yahweh became completely aniconic, which means that he was not represented by a statue or by anything less abstract than some stones. Even in his most famous relic, the Ark of the Covenant, Yahweh is not depicted anywhere. Instead, according to the Bible, Yahweh would appear before the priest sitting on his throne alongside the cherubim when the priest conducted a religious ceremony. But the throne itself is portrayed as empty. Now, having a storm god as your primary god is pretty good if you want to do what the Israelites did and have an excuse to exterminate any nation you want to take their stuff. But not every problem is solved with violence. Almost every problem, but not every problem. Sometimes you need a god that's more paternal, a god that's smarter, a god that's sexier. So what happens when you want to ask something from a god, but your national god isn't the type who specializes in those kinds of petitions? Well, you look for another god who does specialize in what you're asking, of course. That is why, although the Israelites worship Yahweh as their main national god, they did not worship him as their only god, at least not initially. You can see this in the story of Rachel and her father Laban, a very ancient biblical story. In Genesis chapter 31, we learn how Rachel had stolen her father's household idols, hiding them in her camel's saddle. These idols were for worshiping other entities, not Yahweh, because remember, Yahweh was never associated with this type of idol, and they were also used to worship ancestors and practice divination. But by the time that the Bible was being compiled, worshiping exclusively Yahweh was becoming more fashionable among the Israelites, beginning with the prophet Elijah in the 9th century BC, and then gradually, several prophets began saying that Yahweh wanted exclusive worship. However, neither Elijah nor the other prophets ever said that the other gods were false or did not exist. And Elijah never said that there weren't other gods. He simply said that Yahweh was the super coolest, bestest God that the Israelites should worship, apart from the two gods that the Israelites already worshipped. Because although Yahweh was their national God, he was only one of many gods in the Canaanite pantheon. If you look at the Greek pantheon, there is a god of war, a goddess for art, there's a god for everything. But the most important one is the god of the gods, Zeus. Yahweh was the god of storms, but the most important god in that pantheon was El, or Elohim. This is the God of gods, the main God of the divine council, the creator God, the wise God, and the God with a long white beard you imagine when you think of God. Remember, Yahweh was a storm god without icons, but Elohim was the greater, older, and wiser God who had created everything. But by the time that the Bible was being written, Yahweh and Elohim were already being merged into the same God. Over generations outside of the Canaanite influence, the Israelites began to forget the original pantheon and started worshiping both gods, first together and then as the same God. Yet, traces of Elohim as the supreme God and his divine council can still be found in the Bible. In Psalm 82, we hear about the Most High, another way of referencing Elohim, pronouncing judgment among the gods and reminding them that they are his children. In Job 1, Satan even appears before a divine council, claiming that he had been roaming the earth from one end to the other. And in chapter 38 of Deuteronomy, we even see Elohim and Yahweh as separate gods. This chapter is fascinating because it talks about how the God El, the Most High, divides humanity by giving different portions to different gods and giving Yahweh his own portion of humanity, which perfectly aligns with what we know the Israelites believed while the Bible was being written, that there were many gods in the world, but that their God, as Israelites, was Yahweh. This not only shows that Yahweh was inferior to El, but also how different the two gods were. While Yahweh is a warrior, destructive, and enraged God, El is a patient, wise, and powerful creator, the father of all, including Yahweh. Originally, Yahweh was not even associated with creative powers. Those powers would almost contradict his nature, as he did not need them as a warlike, destructive deity. He is so far removed from being a creator that when the Old Testament speaks of creative work, it does not use Yahweh in the form of the Tetragrammaton, but rather El or Elohim. We can see another example of how Elohim speaks to the divine council when he says, "Let us make," in Genesis 1, something that wouldn't make sense if he were the only being, as the modern creation myth says. This is because even though Elohim was the most powerful deity, he is not omniscient or all-powerful, nor is any other god in the pantheon. That is why you need prayers and sacrifices to catch his attention and have your request fulfilled, just like with the other gods. Prayer doesn't make sense for an omniscient being who already knows what you're about to ask even before you do. That's why we constantly see expressions in the Bible like, "God has forgotten about me," when the psalmist wonders how long God will forget him, and in other verses. When your prayers were not answered, it was simply because you had failed to catch the attention of your God, which also explains why the Israelites began praying to other gods when their prayers and sacrifices went unanswered by their God. In the Hebrew Bible, we see how the Israelites later fused El and Yahweh into one God, with Yahweh assimilating most of El's attributes. Yahweh also took on the throne of the divine council, and the lesser gods became his angels, when this religion transformed into monotheism. However, these lesser gods are still only referred to as sons of El, not as sons of Yahweh. Later on, Yahweh is described as a merciful God, slow to anger, and in other proclamations that almost seem to contradict the nature of the original warrior Yahweh, who was once called a man of war. Have you ever wondered why God seems bipolar, super enthusiastic about war in some passages, but then described as slow to anger in others? Well, that's your answer. Yahweh was an extremely violent God. But Elohim was a wise and tremendously powerful God, and later they merged and became one. Remember, Yahweh was originally aniconic, but later he is described as the Father, a wise, old, and patient God. And even later, he becomes a literal father by sending his son to liberate humanity in the New Testament, paving the way for Yahweh not only to become the most powerful God, but the only God. Remember, in biblical times, the gods resided in specific places. Zeus and the other Greek gods had their individual temples. That was where they lived and where they were summoned when they were not residing in the Olympus. And that is why the Ark of the Covenant had a space for God to appear. That's why the Ark was so important, because that was where God dwelled. And later, a temple was built for Yahweh in Jerusalem, and just like with the other Greek gods, that was where he lived and where he was summoned. As long as the temple was there, Yahweh would be among them, for that was where his home was. That is why it was so traumatic for the Israelites when they destroyed Yahweh's temple, because now their God didn't even have a place to live. But not everyone believed that this was the end of everything. After all, if you were told for 1,000 years that your God needs a temple like all the other gods, and if you were told that the temple had been demolished a couple of times before, and that the Israelites had been enslaved only for a chosen one from God to free them and rebuild the temple, then you would probably be looking out for the next chosen one of Yahweh to free you from the Romans so you could rebuild the temple again. And at that time, there were several candidates. Judas the Galilean is God's chosen one in his holy war against Rome. It's the only way to ensure we can rebuild the... Simon of Berea is God's chosen one to be the new king of Israel and lead us in rebuilding his temple. Yahweh would lead him to victory against the Romans. Judas is the new prophet of Yahweh. Look, he's going to part the Jordan River just like Moses to lead... The Egyptian, he is the one who will lead us to victory and whom Yahweh had chosen to tear down the walls of our oppressor, to expel the Romans and rebuild. Sir, all of God's chosen ones end up being dead before they can rebuild the temple? Yeah, but I have the solution because actually, God's chosen one is this carpenter. Ooh, but that one's already dead. Yup, like 30 years ago, nailed to a cross. Think about that, sir. No one's going to take a carpenter who died nailed to some planks seriously. No. Surprisingly, no one will ever think about it. Don't worry. But how is he going to rebuild the temple if he's already dead? That's the beauty of it. He won't. What? Yeah, look, he said that if certain things he predicted happened, then that would mean that we no longer need a temple to worship Yahweh. And what did he predict would happen for that to be possible? That he would die. No, I think we better keep looking for Yahweh's chosen one to rebuild his temple. But this chosen one is already dead, which means we don't need no temple. Yahweh has always needed, but this chosen one is already dead. Yes, but that doesn't mean that, and that means we don't need no temple. No, because, yeah, in fact, he was pretty special. He's the Messiah promised in these parts of the Testament. You know, the only Testament, because no one has written a new one yet. I already started the new one and wrote that Jesus' body disappeared. I made another version of which he resurrects. In my version, he's the Son of God and will save all humanity, not just the Jews. In my version, he is God. This is getting out of hand. We need to rethink this and rebuild the temple because all versions are good. This little guy is the Jews, and this little group, the Christians. And the Christians made a monumental movement that transformed Yahweh into a God you could worship anywhere, not just in the temple, elevating him not only as a God who did not want you to worship other gods, but as the only God who existed. Romans tried to stop them at first, but 200 years later, Constantine converted to Christianity and went on to convert the entire Roman Empire, making its religion so powerful and widespread that it survived the fall of the Roman Empire itself, converting peoples and those across all of Europe who were not part of the empire and making them repent from their sins so they could be saved by Jesus or else. Then, another group will write a sequel to the Bible claiming that Jesus Christ is not the Messiah, just another prophet, and that the true prophet was the author of that new book, a book that did not invalidate the Bible, but was just as important or more so than the Bible. If you believed them, you were a Muslim, but you were also hated and persecuted by many peoples. So the Muslims eventually ended up looking for land in the Middle East, building iconic temples there, and looking for more people to convert to their religion. That was the attitude of the conquerors when they found the new world and discovered it full of pagans who sacrificed people to the sun, like the sun was real. So they converted as many people to Christianity as they could and sacrificed the rest so efficiently that by the time Mexico wanted to gain independence from Spain, it was a Catholic priest who united the first rebellion under the image of the Virgin Mary, which became the first official flag of the country. Then another group will write a sequel to the Bible claiming that Jesus Christ is not the Messiah, just another prophet, and that the true prophet was the author of that new book, one that did not invalidate the Bible, but was just as important or even more so than the Bible. If you believed them, you were a Mormon, but you were also hated and persecuted by many. So the Mormons ended up looking for land in the middle of Utah, United States, building iconic temples and seeking more people there to convert to their religion. This is the true history of God. A storm god so unimportant that his origins was probably lost long before he became famous. A god originated in Canaanite mythology, adopted by the Israelites as their national god, merged with Elohim to grant him creative powers, elevated by Jesus Christ so that no one needed a temple or to be Jewish in order to follow him, and with so many possible interpretations that countless religions have emerged claiming that their interpretation of God is the correct one. And the best part is that the interpretation of God as a god of war and the like was also long forgotten, and those religions have always been super respectful when debating their interpretations of God. Right?